Well, hello everybody. This is Doc Sander again. This week, we are going to have a very, I think, timely conversation and something that's very important as we move forward in Lunch with Doc. And I guess for the last couple months, I've been talking to Associate Commissioner of the Big Ten, Rick Boyages, about topics that would really be good for coaches. And of course, Rick was a very successful coach, both at the Division III level and the Division I level. He was the youngest coach in the country. He got his first head coaching job at 24, so he has a pretty good idea about that. He also was a assistant at Boston College and assistant at Ohio State, and then ran the William and Mary program for a number of years. So Rick has a really good idea. And then he kind of moved into administration, and he became, the associate commissioner for basketball for the Mid-American Conference. And then I guess the last, I don't know how many, 6 or 7 years, Rick has been associate commissioner for the Big Ten in regard to basketball. But one of his major responsibilities is to deal with officials. And I think Rick actually runs a consortium of supervisors of officials for maybe 6 different conferences. So he's a guy that is very knowledgeable about officiating, and being the associate commissioner of the Big Ten, I'm sure he hears from the coaches all the time about the officiating and how good it is, or when calls are questioned. I know from talking to Rick, I know he goes through and he reviews hundreds of calls a week. So he's probably sees more basketball than just about anybody in the country. So I don't know where he is right now, but he was going to join us. But so we're going to kind of go ahead because everybody's here. And so I want to introduce the 2 officials who we have with us. And I'll let them kind of tell a little bit about themselves. But Bo Boroski and Larry Scirotto, 2 guys who have called in numerous conferences. Bo calls in the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Big East, and probably other conferences too. And Larry has calls in the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the Mountain West. So these guys have seen a lot of games. I know Bo has called Final Four. I think Larry has called maybe Sweet 16. So these guys are very nationally recognized and tremendously quality officials. So I just wanted to kind of get this thing rolling and turn this over to them. You don't really want to hear from me, but I'll go to Bo. Bo, I know you've seen a lot of really good coaches, and I just always wondered, what are your thoughts on how you feel the best way for a coach and a referee to kind of communicate?
Yeah, certainly appreciate the introduction. The communication for me is a two-way street, and I think officials have an obligation, regardless of any past history or anything, other circumstances out of your control. We have an obligation to go in with an open mindset, a willing communicator, and personally, I can tell you I have that same expectation for coaches, and it helps me mentally know going into a game that two-way street is open, and I go above and beyond, even at the opening handshake, to be very general in my terminology and communication with them, but to let them know that hey, I'm here to communicate. You got a question, you ask me. We'll have that conversation. If we're treated, and officials, if the viewpoint from a coach is that an official is a necessary evil, if an official is beneath them in some way, then that is going to negatively affect how I communicate. I can't speak for other people. It certainly won't affect what we call and what we don't call. But as we get into crunch time and a coach wants to have a conversation, if we've had 30 minutes of disrespect, we're probably just going to move on and stand in different spots and let the clock expire. So I really put a lot of weight into the ability to communicate, and I look for that same in return from coaches on the most general level.
Larry, you got the same kind of thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think this is a relational business. When we talk at camps, when we're talking to newer officials, we talk about the ability to communicate is a separator in this business. I think when Rick talks about what his biggest issue with coaches to officiating is that they don't talk. They don't talk to us, or they're not responsive in the moment, right? And if we'll tell these campers, hey, listen, like, you need to be responsive and communicate with everybody, not to the point that it's distractive, but to the point that you're building relationships with assistant coaches who eventually will be head coaches. And that communication is going to build relationships of trust. I mean, this is still people's business, no matter how we look at it, even if it's an emotionally charged people's business for 2.5 hours. The communication is key. And I think the officials that are better at it have the capability to diffuse situations that are about to occur, or when they do occur, that they're easier to get the game back on track.
So now, I'm sure you've talked to coaches on numerous occasions about how you expect their players to respond to officiating. Can you kind of share your thoughts if coach said, okay, Larry, Bo, I really want to know how to communicate with my players, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate with the referees?
Yeah, I think in collegiate officiating, it's a lot different than maybe the pros, because the players they're young men, but they play their role and they don't get involved with officiating too much. Obviously, again, I think we as a society, we're becoming much more engaged in communication at all levels. So the captains have a big role. The role players have a big role, those that have the ability to engage in a respectful way usually get the same type of engagement and conversation that we give the coaches, right? If your players are capable of responding in an adult manner, then we're going to give you the same adult responses that we give the coaches. I mean, they're still young men in this game, and they need to be treated as such. I think if an official, no different than maybe a parent, when you see someone interacting with your kids, the better we treat their kids, I believe, then the better our relationship is with the coaches.
Yeah, the kids can make or break you from an officiating standpoint. We see a lot of the guys, same players, day in and day out. And I think there's a mutual respect there. We empathize with the microscope and the focus that's on them, not just from the media, but even a social media aspect as well. We have very few instances of negative interactions with players. The only time we get involved with players is really fouls, at times flagrant fouls. You get the occasional ejection for non-basketball, extreme severe type plays. But the players are, as everybody on this call knows, fighting for playing time. And they know if they do something to the detriment of their team, they're going to be on the bench. So it's typically, when you talk about negative interactions, players are usually not a part of that conversation. I think it's tied a lot to, I'm not sure how this sounds, but we'll find out. But a lot of these kids don't know how to communicate with an official. I know that if you look at, take the Milwaukee Bucks, for example, they hired Ed Rush, a former NBA supervisor and former official, to be an assistant coach, just to teach their players on the Bucks how to talk to referees, how to approach an official. And they took those steps because my guess is they weren't great at it. And they knew maybe throughout the course of a game that it could equate into points. And though, like I told you, no matter what the situation, you have to beat the tape. But from a coach's perspective, or the administration from the Bucks, maybe they thought, we're not as good at communicators as we could be with the guys we see that share the court. Let's try and get better at that and see if it has a positive net outcome. And so to your question, there's really not a whole lot of negative interaction. I really look forward to some of the kind of big personalities that are the players. I love interacting with those guys in the pregame, in the captain's meeting, because it earns you the benefit of the doubt. If I approach the point guard at UCLA before the game and I make a tough call against them, that could be the difference in him punting the basketball or walking up to me and saying, "Hey, Bo, what'd I do on that play?" And that's ultimately what we're after, is a professional back and forth communication until that clock hits 0.
So now, to you guys, of course, you're in preeminent conferences, and I guess at the end of a game, I'm sure there's always going to be, some questionable calls. What kind of feedback do y'all get from, the conference? From do you go back and look at those, those plays? Does somebody go back and say, okay, well, maybe that wasn't the right call, or yeah, that was the right call? What kind of feedback do you get?
There were so many variables in what you just said, Doc, that are so subjective. I can walk off the court, and if I had, 30 plays of interest, for lack of a better term, 20 that were fouls and 10 that were no calls, I may walk off the court and think I was perfect. But my supervisor may want to talk about these 4 plays, and he may have a strong opinion about a couple of them. And again, that communication piece comes in. Every play from every game is broken down. That's definitely true in the Big Ten. It's definitely true, just from a discussion standpoint in the Big East. The Pac-12 has a whole leadership team with game graders. And it's true typically, I would imagine, for most of Division I. The level of accountability is so high. But Doc, this subjectivity piece is so big because, UCLA, and I'm picking on them because I'm looking at Michael Lewis's face. I'm trying to figure out how to turn off his, his video here, change my screen. But, when he comes at me, his interest is UCLA. And when they're playing Arizona, when Sean Miller talks to me, he's going to come at me from Arizona's perspective. We're one of 3 people in that building that really don't care who wins or loses. We want to, the single most important thing we do is try and get plays right. That's number 1. And if it's not number 1 for every official, then they've got an incorrect mindset. So, but 1B, empathy, communication, that type of approach that helps you get through that 2-hour period, helps you earn the benefit of the doubt on some of those subjective plays that you referenced, Doc. But the breakdown and the scrutiny is obviously huge from a stakeholder standpoint, fans and media members and administrations and coaches. But the people whose opinions matter are the people that we report to and that we work with. And outside of that, it's just noise. But we have to have the ability to look at a play and say, Coach gave me a really hard time on this play. I just rewatched it. I blew it. And you've got to have the gumption to be able to go and look at that coach to start the second half, or the next time you see him 2 weeks or a month later, and say, Coach, you gave me a hard time about the block charge play at minute 14. I was dead wrong. I wish I could change it. I can't, but I told you I'd give you feedback, and here it is. If you don't have a little piece of that empathy as a part of your DNA, you're just not going to be around very long. So that's my perspective on that.
It's interesting. I've got a question here from Serge Clement, and his question, he's at Marist College. He said, what can assistant coaches do to diffuse situations with, he used the word, overzealous ref and a fired up head coach?
Yeah, I think that's, an assistant has, at least in my opinion, a responsibility to diffuse, to engage, to interrupt this cycle between the head coach and the official, especially in that emotionally charged moment. Oftentimes, the assistant coach just tapping the head coach on the hip, kind of stepping in as a shield, doing those overt actions that will break the cycle of the interaction between the official and the coach. I mean, let's recognize that we're all alpha personalities in that regard. And especially in the moment, we can all get lost, no matter how good of an official you are, how good of a coach you can get lost in the moment of emotion. And the assistant coaches oftentimes have the ability to interject in a meaningful way to avoid technical fouls, to avoid potential ejections, to even breaking the cycle for the official. When you see somebody stepping in front of you, then it breaks that direct eye contact you have with the head coach. And I think it gets everybody back on track. What I would say is, like TSA says, see something, say something, do something. Don't allow this engagement with the head coach and the referee to spiral out of control, where now everybody regrets the end decision and we end up losing the coach on an ejection, and now the official is put in a bad light. And I think at times, not always, at times, I think the assistant coaches can be the peacekeeper in the moment. And it's important to engage in that type of interruption, if I may, for the benefit of the game.
Well, yeah. I mean, Bo, go ahead.
Oh, man, I can't keep referencing Michael Lewis talking about assistant coaches, so I'll just move on to part B of my response. But I'll tell you, I have gotten so much better. I want to pat myself on the back with assistant coaches, because my first few years, Serge, I'll tell you this, I didn't realize, I thought once you were an assistant coach, that's just what you were. I mean, if your dentist is your dentist for your whole life, I thought assistant coaches that's what they were. They're assistant coaches. Then about 5 or 6 years in, I realized that assistant coaches become head coaches. Okay. And then I'm like, man, I really, that new guy at school X or school Y, I know for a fact he doesn't care for me because of the interactions we've had. And that's not hypothetical. That's real. And that has been a part of my growth as an official. And it really altered the way that I approached and communicated with assistant coaches. When I see an assistant coach, I think two things. I think peacemaker, or I think escalator. And that's how I define assistant coaches. If I have a problem with a player during the game, I usually try and go to an assistant coach, just out of respect for the head coach, having his hand full in that moment. So I might go, to an assistant that I know and I know to be a good communicator, and I'll tell him, hey, your guy 24 probably just got away with a foul. Tell him to, clean this up, or he's got to do this, or this will happen. If you could, kind of let him know, it'll mean more coming from you than from me. And the assistant coach might say, hey, hang on, and pull the player out and say, tell him to his face. That's the type of engagement we're looking for. They talk about dress for the job you want, not the job you got. And I think that's what I look for out of assistant coaches, is that kind of above and beyond, over the top communication that I go into a game that I referenced earlier in the call. I think the best assistant coaches will come out and they'll take advantage of an early media timeout, or even before the game when we're standing there for 10 minutes with nothing to do. And, they might say, hey, Bo, this is my scout here. So if something goes sideways, come to me, or Bo, I've been working with the bigs. We got a hell of a matchup today with the guy from Purdue. Like, let us know if you see something. That type of kind of prepare and prevent approach really goes a long way with me. Because I'd rather do that than the whole repair and repent thing. The game's only 2 hours. By the time I can try and fix something that's broken, it's too late. And typically when those things happen, it's the communication that's gone bad. And I do really well with all coaches, heads or assistants, that want to communicate. But the guys that don't want to have any sort of professional relationship for a couple hours, I'll typically have a hard time.
Let me just say, Rick texted me. He said he had a fire that he had to put out. He has put it out, so he's on now. But I just want to ask you one question. Is that pretty typical of most officials that, they would prefer for, like assistant coaches to kind of, connect with them prior to the game or something like that? Or is that just kind of you think?
I think it's a responsibility for all of us, right? And there are coaches that don't want, and if your head coach doesn't want you engaging with referees, then obviously don't get fired. But if you have coaches that are receptive to interaction, then I think it's a benefit to everyone, because they're oftentimes, like Bo said, the head coach is going to, in timeouts or dead ball situations, the head coach is going to be so involved in the moment that he doesn't have the opportunity to engage us on secondary issues. And I think that's where the assistants can, based on building those relationships pre-game, media timeouts, whatever the case may be, they have an opportunity to get more information to us, and they have opportunity to get information from us to the head coaches. So I think it's an obligation, if I'm being honest, in that regard.
Great. Well, Rick, let me introduce you. Like I said, Rick Boyages, Associate Commissioner, Big Ten for basketball. Rick's, done an incredible job of forming a consortium and has great relationships with both coaches, and he hears it from both sides. So, Rick, why don't you talk a little bit about how you function and how you are always working to make sure that, these games are officiated to a point that is the best possible result. I think Rick, you on there, buddy?
You got to unmute him, Doc, I think.
Sorry, Doc. It's, things have been quiet around the office the last week. I apologize. Hasn't been much work going on. You can hear a pin drop, Doc. You know those days, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Just kind of.
I knew Boroski and Scirotto would bail me out for a little bit. I think the first thing for everybody to realize is that officiating's been regionalized over the last 5 to 8 years. So there's really almost six exclusive regional groups now, led by some of the A5 conferences. Some share responsibilities, like Big East and ACC work together, along with the Colonial, the A10, and others. The SEC now has the American, Atlantic Sun, Southern Conference, Sun Belt, I think the SWAC. Pac-12 has Mountain West, West Coast Conference, Big West, Big Sky. We have 6 leagues with the Big Ten. We have Metro Atlantic, America East, Horizon, Mid-American, and Summit. So what's basically happened is developed farm systems for all of us, development, training. A lot of things have been centralized. It's been really efficient and effective. And the other thing that's happened, Doc, is we work with the national coordinator and the rules committee. So there's not 31 coordinators in one room with the national coordinator, and the push and pull there, and the egos and the personalities. Now there's kind of like 15 and maybe like 6 regional heads that really are trying to referee the game the same way. So we understand the stereotypes that are out there, that the play on the East Coast is the same as the West Coast, or for years, the Big Ten was overly physical, all this. That's really changed. Those are kind of old notions now, and there's a lot more synergy from coast to coast. So that's the first thing everybody should realize. The other thing is the way Bo was talking about assistant coaches becoming head coaches. Just understand, if you're an assistant in a low mid-major technically, or whatever you want to call it, any of the leagues that if you look at the power rankings, would be rated 15 to 30 plus, those officials are going to become A5 officials. They're going to move up the ladder as well. So if you're an assistant coach or head coach at the lower level and move up, it's going to be some of the same dynamics. But we have technology, we have online training, virtual training. Basically, when Larry and Bo are on a game, every play is evaluated, every call and every no call. They're graded on the entire game. And then in the Big Ten, for instance, we pull about 15 to 20 video clips from the game and put them together in a montage that's sent to them the next morning. So they see all the grading. They see plays that we think we feel they missed. There's a description about what we thought from that standpoint, but there's also details for the database, the half, the time, whether it was a foul, a no call, a violation, a no call of a violation, then the specific topic. Is it a restricted area arc play? Is it a verticality play? Is it a block charge? All that stuff is coded and goes into the database so that we can build training tapes. We don't have to go back through old videos looking for illegal screens. We just tell the computer, give us all the illegal screens from the last 2 weeks. And my tech guy will say, Rick, do you want the whistles illegal screens that were wrong or the no call illegal screens that were wrong? And then we'll talk about how many of those are in there, and we'll put out a training tape. So I think your heads would spin if you saw the type of technology that's taken place nationally. And now everything is electronic. You don't have to put 7 clips on a VHS tape and put it through snail mail. I mean, we get it instantaneously. So Bo and Larry will tell you, you know, it's fine for coaches or assistant coaches to submit 4, 5, 6 plays from any game. But you'll get guys that just try to break your chops, and they'll send in 42 clips from one game. And you just know they're just breaking your chops. They're trying to waste your time. We'll go through the exercise once or twice, but we'll then communicate that, you know, that's not productive for anybody. What are the keys? What were the plays you were most disappointed in? What are the trends you're seeing? And we talk about a lot of those things with our crew even before the game. Bo and Larry will tell you that we have conversations before the game starts about just styles of play, trying to protect players, make sure we don't put cheap fouls on guys and send them to the bench, time and score scenarios. There's a lot of nuance and judgment, and it's really much more of an art than a science. So let me stop there.
Well, let me ask you a question, Bo and Larry. You know, as a coach, is there 2 or 3 things that you would really recommend that they teach these kids to avoid, you know, getting in foul trouble or, you know, creating traveling violations? Is there any 2 or 3 things that you traditionally see that you don't think, you know, kids are coached well enough on to avoid, you know, the negative impact of, you know, not being coached at that particular skill or talent?
I think, go ahead, Bo.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from my perspective, you know, officiating and the points of emphasis are cyclical. So the last couple years has been a very similar message to about 7 or 8 years ago when they introduced what we all know as 10-1-4. And you coaches may not know what 10-1-4 is, but you do know the hand checks, the cheap whistles outside on the perimeter. Well, we had that, you know, drilled into our head that, guys, we're going to focus on 3 big things this year, okay? Offense initiated contact, 10-1-4 plays, those hand checks and those forearms with you know, out on the perimeter, and screening. I think that the coaches would be doing themselves a service if they would identify what those points of emphasis are, because if the national coordinator is saying, hey, these are the big 3, if they're pushing it to the officials, they're really hammering it to guys like Rick and other leaders throughout the country that control, 5 guys essentially control 2,500 officials nationally. So, and that number's so big because there's a hierarchy, as Rick mentioned, when you start getting in the small college level that is used as kind of a minor league system. But Rick's message to us is going to be, you know, quite simply, like, you know, keep an eye on their screens, you know, watch out for the offense initiated contact. Those are the talking points. And I think if coaches reiterated to their players that these are the big 3 things they're looking at. And if we can keep the better players on the court, it's going to make our game better. It doesn't mean we don't penalize those players when they do those acts. But when I put air in the whistle, I have a high degree of certainty. And when I'm penalizing bigs, of which you may have none of, one of, two of, three if you're lucky, I really want those plays to show up on tape. A cheap foul on a guard, it might not even hit your radar if you're a coach. You just come to expect it. Oh, hand check, go get them out. You got 8 guards. That's almost the mindset. I specifically and vividly recall hanging fouls on guards and thinking that wasn't a very strong call, and I don't hear a word. But if I hang a foul on a big that I know is 100% correct, I always get pushback on it. So we're empathetic to that, and information is power. But I think that if, whether it's an assistant coach or a head coach, took the time to understand the message that the officials are receiving, then I think the net outcome of that would be a positive one.
Okay. And I was a football player, so I think sometimes I use this analogy, you got to learn when to punt, right? You can't go 4th down and 15 every time. And so I say gamble plays are important to understand for players. Like if the gamble is you're late on defense, you're not going to be in time to get a charge, it's going to be a block, and you have a pretty clear idea that that's going to be the reality. Is it worth allowing 2 points not to gamble instead of picking up a 3rd foul? And that's the punt analogy. Like if your big is on the bench for the next 12 minutes because he's picked up his 3rd foul in the 2nd minute of the 2nd half, was it worth the gamble? And if you can teach the kids not to gamble on plays that they just won't win on, or there's a higher probability that they're going to lose on that play and pick up a 3rd foul, I think it's like that playing smartly analogy is really important. And I think sometimes kids just miss it. They'll do cute shit or they'll gamble on a play that they know they're not going to win on. And all of a sudden they've got a 3rd foul and they're sitting on the bench and they're an impact player with a 3rd foul on the bench.
Yeah, I mean, you guys talk about bigs, and this is just my own observation, and I just wonder about this because it seems to me that the game has gotten to be where, when the ball goes into the post, the first initial contact is like, who's the strongest guy, who can knock, the offensive guy knock the defensive post player backwards. How much contact is allowed in that situation from the offensive standpoint? And a lot of times, and I don't know, I'm watching TV, they go, oh, well, it's the second bump that always gets the call. Is there any truth to that?
Well, there's nothing in our rule book about second bump, but I think it's in the, TV announcer 101 manual for sure. Listen, basketball is a contact sport. Okay. Football is a collision sport. And I understand the difference. I know that there's been rules put in place over the last 8 years to clean it up a little bit. And I think it needed to be cleaned up because it was starting to look a little bit more like a collision sport. But there's a phrase in our business and officiating that is taboo. You just can't say it. So since this call is being recorded, I'll say it so I'm on the record. Advantage, disadvantage. And we are told, call the rules as written. Okay, don't apply advantage, disadvantage. It's either a foul or it's not. And there's a name for those officials, and they're called unemployed. It's not reality. And I think you have to have a feel for the game. And coaches, more than anybody, can tell right away if an official has a feel for the game. They know. And I know if they have a feel for the game. Like I can tell when it's your scout. I can tell when you're the guy that coaches the bigs. It's part of that mutual empathy and respect that we have for each other, or that we should have. But advantage, disadvantage in the post, okay, is difficult because, Doc, what if you got a mismatch? What if there was a switch and then we got 6'2" on 6'9"? Well, that 6'2" guy throws a forearm or a push that is inconsequential, that felt like a mosquito on his back. Is that a foul? So that's the type of decisions we have to make. Did action A cause action B? on rebounding, there's tons of holds and pulls and jersey grabs. Call the ones that matter. If the ball goes in, I might have air in my belly ready to blow the whistle. But if that ball goes in and there's a little jockeying, let's play basketball. Now, that could be interpreted as being rough or being too rough. And I'm willing to accept that criticism for a flow for the game, because that's ultimately what we're at. We want that clock to go. We want there to be flow. We want the players to be the stars of the show. But I also have an obligation to blow the whistle when it's illegal. And part of one of the variables of illegal contact is calling plays that matter. So on that same play where the ball goes in the bucket, if it were to be missed and now white goes to get the rebound, but blue's got that same hold that he just had when the ball get in, now it's a foul. And I think that that's the type of feel, that's the type of instantaneous processing that guys that are in Rick's position look for in determining who can manage major moments, who can, go into this, that UCLA Cal game, that Michigan State game, and officiate it as closely to the rules as written, as fairly as possible for both teams involved. And I think the best officials in this country know the rules to a T, incorporate advantage, disadvantage, and those are the officials that seem to thrive and survive in our business.
I think that's a really great insight. I hope everybody picked up on that. I guess one of the things, how much, and Rick, and if you guys could talk a little bit about this, how much input do you guys get to, identify, those points of emphasis for the coming year? How much input do you have to the NCAA about the game, about rule changes, that sort of thing?
We have tremendous input. And my philosophy is when I want to push for a rule change or a point of emphasis, I back it up with video. And we're looking at repetitive plays. So it's no surprise, we experimented with the restricted area arc in the Big Ten, in the Mid-American Conference, the year before it came in. I had an idea, but we were willing to experiment for a year. We've probably changed out of our consortium. I bet you we've had an impact on 7 or 8 rule changes just in the last 5 years. And I lean on guys like Larry and Bo. We're constantly talking about what's good for the game. What do we need? What's confusing? How do we clarify? The guys on the call will see, if you watched JD Collins's video that went out to coaches this summer, we made some adjustments to the 20-second reset rule in the front court, because it was too confusing. We had other situations where it would change back to 30, and confusion leads to mistakes and inconsistencies. So we have so much video, Doc, that typically I can show people why we need a new rule and give them, 6, 8, 10 examples from games the prior season that either were or could have been major issues in college basketball. And when I look at those situations, first thing I say to myself is, what would happen if this occurred in a national championship game, the national championship game? What would we do? Sometimes we don't have a rule for something. So yeah, I'll let Larry jump in. We have a lot of input, much more than we've ever had before. And some of it starts with coaches that put us, onto certain things. Or we, on that same video, JD talked about kind of that Harden rule, or the NBA trick where shooters now, if they see that a defender's hand is out in their cylinder near their body, they move the ball in a certain way and they go right up into a jump shot, foul on the wrist. They suck a guy into a foul. Well, it's a foul. The question is, where, at what part of shooting motion, where did it begin? And JD, his comment this year was, if the contact occurs while the player is moving the ball laterally, it's not a shooting foul, but if he starts to come up and there's contact, obviously it's going to be a shot, foul, and usually a lot of those are 3-pointers. So take note, he's not, the national coordinator is just not sending that out for his own health. Those have been vetted through all the Division I coordinators of officials, and then through the regional consortiums, and then on up. So, the last thing I'll say is Bo referenced 10-1-4. You have to understand, 8-9 years ago, we were scoring in the high 50s. Something had to be done. Defense had much more an advantage. The games were not exciting. There wasn't a lot of offense. It was a defensive grind. So the Ben's basketball committee, Jeff Hathaway's on here. He was a stakeholder. The rules committee, the NABC, everybody gets on board for what's good for the game, and so we needed to open it up, and we need to allow cutters to cut without chucking, off-ball forearms chuck. We used to always do that stuff. There was a lot of physicality that was just coached into the game, but defense got ahead of offense. And so we had to make adjustments. So we went overboard the first 2 or 3 years. And now we use a term called offense-initiated contact. Well, that was a result of going overboard and calling a lot of lighter fouls and taking out a lot of physicality. The offensive players, especially the guards, quickly realized if you jump into a guy and cause contact, if you lean your shoulder in on a drive to the hoop and cause contact, they're putting fouls on everything. You can get a foul. And then we had to recalibrate because those weren't fouls. The defender was doing nothing wrong. So there was nuance in the last couple years. And now offense-initiated contact and legal verticality are key terms that we use night in and night out. And we say that these are not fouls on the defense as much as we're saying get the defense's hand off, get the defense's forearm off, get the defense from body bumping. So there's a much more collaboration amongst administrators, commissioners, associate commissioners of the sport, the rules committee, the NABC, the national coordinator for officials, and the rules committee than there's ever been, I think, in my 35 years in the game. Larry?
Yeah, it's a note to the assistant coaches that while we have great influence and input, there's not a referee that sits on the rules committee. There's a referee that's picked per year in an advisory role, but he is not a voting member into what rules will be adjudicated. So when a head coach says, hey, Larry, flopping, that is bullshit, and I can't believe you guys are calling that. We didn't create the rule. The rules committee created the rule, which is part of your peer group. So we only are adjudicating what our charge is once the season starts. So while I may agree or disagree with whatever the 21 rule changes are that the committee sends to us for enforcement that year, the reality of it is it was created by your peer group. So if you want to be mad at someone, be mad at one of the 14 members on that panel. Don't be mad at the officials because we're only tasked with enforcing that charge. And to be quite honest, if we don't, then we're unemployed. So the reality of it is once we get our direction, we didn't create them, but we're going to enforce them. And oftentimes it's to the dismay and the chagrin of half the coaching staffs in America. But the reality is that's what basketball, your peer group, your head coaches across the country want, and that's going to be our charge at the end of the day. At that point, we're just the foot soldiers enforcing and adjudicating rules.
Okay, we're going to kind of close this up, but I got one question for Larry and Bo. We'll go with Larry first because you got the mic right now. If you had to change one role, what would it be?
If I had to change, I would widen the box, or widen the box for post play, get more space similar to the NBA where you're getting people out of the lane. I think that's a benefit. We create space, we minimize contact, and then you have a much more open game.
I think assistant coaches should make the same money as their head coaches. I just wanted to be loved by coaches for 1 minute there, but no, I'll, instead of going specific like Larry did, I'll be a little bit more global. I think the rules should be simplified, and we have to deal with things like time frames for correctable errors and certain parameters where if this occurs, then this happens. But if the clock didn't start, then this happens. But if it did start properly, then this happens, but only if that possession has ended and the ball was dead. My point is, I know the rules. I have an obligation to know the rules, and I am very confused by several of them. So when you start talking about correctable error situations, and then we have other situations where, well, on that technical foul, you shoot 1 free throw, but on this one, you shoot 2. But this one doesn't count as a personal foul, but this one does. So and at some point, the stakeholders, the fans, the administrators, we're going to the monitor. Okay, we're having huddles, and everybody gets frustrated. Well, newsflash, we get frustrated too. But if we don't get it right with the use of the monitor, it's a bad look. And so you can definitely shorten that curve by having very fluent rules knowledge. But when you start getting in situations where some fouls take precedence over other actions, and then saying, okay, well, whose ball is it? Okay, it goes to the offended team. What do we do with the shot clock? Well, I don't know. Let's go back and take another look. It can get very cluttered. It can be very cumbersome and very frustrating, and we bear the brunt of it. Now, to the NCAA's credit, they just made a change this summer in that vein to make things easier as it relates to the ball more consistently being awarded at the 28-foot hash or the 3-foot tick mark. So just an overall simplification of what we're asked to do, I think would be kind of an overhaul, but I don't think it would be that difficult. But the last few changes that have been made have been to make things easier. And so that's a good trend I hope continues.
Well, hey, I really appreciate you guys taking time out to share your thoughts and ideas. And, you know, I think one of the things that became so clear in this whole thing is communication is so critical, and understanding, you know, that the officials are always trying to do the best job that they can. They have no, for lack of a better term, no dog in the fight. They're just trying to make every play be called the right way. And I think you guys take great care. The amount of effort that you put into it, the amount of time that you invest in this to become knowledgeable, to know the game, all those sort of things. Everybody needs to kind of understand that. So I appreciate what you guys do. Rick, thanks so much for what you do. And, you know, Bo and Larry, appreciate you taking your time out. You'll probably run into some of these guys, you know, out on the road this year.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. We appreciate the time as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks.